So Ivan, in this hour, we're going to start getting into some of the books, the historical books, starting with Joshua. But before we do that, I'm thinking about something you said earlier, and it's kind of left a question in my mind. We were talking about the narrator, and you mentioned how the narrator seemed to have some godlike qualities, all-knowing and present everywhere. So who are we talking about here, and how could that be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I should have covered that back then. Well, I think only one human kind of person would fit that category, where they are given this amazing insight into things that ordinary humans do not have access to. Like, for example, the heavenly code of God, where he is deliberating with his own code as to how to make human beings and so forth, and in bedrooms and all of these places. And I think that would be a prophet. So I think whoever these authors were originally, they would be prophetic figures, and they would be given that insight through divine revelation. And so it's interesting that in the Hebrew canon is divided into three parts. You have the law, which is the first 5 books. Then you have the prophets, which is the second category. And then you have the writings, which is the largest category. And the prophets are divided into 8 books. 4 books, which they call the former prophets, and 4 books, which they call the latter prophets. The former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So in the Hebrew canon, these historical books, Joshua to Kings, is actually in the prophetic section. Now, why is that? Because probably if they were categorizing them according to authorship, they probably believed it was prophets who wrote these books. It was a prophet who finally wrote Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings. So if that is true, then that's what we have. We have prophetic figures who are given divine insight into heavenly things. And we have an example of that. We have Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6, who is he receives a heavenly vision of God in his court. You have Micaiah in 1 Kings, 18 or something like that, where he is raised up into the court of God and gets to hear what's going on in there. So I think that's who we are talking about. So these authors would ultimately have been prophets, in my view, and that's how they have this insight.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. So let's jump into Joshua, book of Joshua. So what are some things that we should be thinking about as we read this book?
Yeah, amazing book, fantastic book, and so relevant to life today. Maybe we can talk about some of the practical applications of this book later on. Well, the book of Joshua is all about the conquest of the land and the occupation of it by Israel, the people that come back. Yeah, one of the things about the historical books is we talked about they witness to the progression of God's kingdom, his salvation history upon the earth. If you ask yourself this question, what is the big idea of the Bible? If you were to summarize the whole Bible into one sentence, let's say, what would it be? I normally ask my students this, and you'll get everything from love of God to Jesus to everything. But what I will hardly ever hear is the whole Bible is about the eruption of God's kingdom upon the earth. But here we spell eruption with an I, not an E. I-R-R-U-P-T-I-O-N, irruption of God's kingdom. An irruption is something that impacts, let's say, the world from outside. A meteorite erupts upon the earth. A volcano, spelled with E, eruption, is something that boils up from within, right? So when you eat something bad, your stomach erupts the stuff out, right? It comes from within. The Bible is about God bringing his kingdom from outside and establishing it upon the earth. The whole Bible is about that, how he's turning the kingdoms of this world into the kingdoms of his Christ, him and of his Christ. It's basically the summary of the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So if the whole Bible is about God establishing his kingdom, there are two aspects of it. The Old Testament covers one part of that kingdom, and that part, the part that the Old Testament covers, is the literal, material, very physical establishment of that kingdom. It's physical. In the New Testament, it becomes more spiritual. The kingdom becomes more spiritual, but we are in the Old Testament historical books. A kingdom requires four things at the minimum in order for it to function. First of all, you need a common people to have a kingdom. Secondly, you need a common constitution that binds these people together. Thirdly, you need land. You need a common land on which the people live and practice their constitution. And finally, fourthly, you need a common leader that's going to bind them all together. Now, if you look at the Pentateuch and the historical books, really what's unfolding is how these four elements of the kingdom are gradually given by God for his people. So, for example, in the kingdom element of Genesis, I would say, what Genesis tells us is who are the people of this kingdom. It delineates who the people are, and they're going to be the children of Abraham. Where Abraham is chosen in Genesis 12. That will be the people of the kingdom. Then what we get in Exodus and Leviticus and the first part of Numbers is the constitution that's going to bind these people together. So once God has his people, then we move to the giving of the constitution, the Ten Commandments, and the Mosaic Law. That's what will bind the people together.
The laws.
The laws,
of the
yeah.
people.
That will be their founding document and their constitution, as it were. But they're still missing two elements. And the next element that they have to get in order to be a kingdom is, of course, land. And that is what we get in the books of Joshua and Judges, to some extent. That is the God giving them their third element. And then the remaining element is, of course, the king. And that's what we'll get in the books of Samuel and so forth. So now all the elements are in place. So Joshua is concerned with that third element of a kingdom, how the people of God receive the land upon which they are going to live, they're going to build their families, they're going to build their temple, they're going to relate to God. Every culture needs land in which to survive. Land and life are very closely related. And so this is what it is. But the book comes with a fair bit of controversy.
And
and
because there's already people.
There are already people in the land.
In the land.
There are already people in the land.
Israel has to
do something that is... Yes,
drive
exactly. It's a very difficult thing. And this is one of the controversies that we have to deal with as we come to the book of Joshua. One is, I think, a little bit more, it's not as serious, and that is the archaeological evidence for the kind of invasion and taking over that is described in the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua describes a massive invasion of Israel that carries out three campaigns: the central campaign against Jericho and Ai, and then the southern campaign against the northern campaign against the northern cities, and then the southern campaign, and boom, lightning strikes and takes over the land. Well, the archaeological record does not seem to support that kind of a taking over of this part of this territory. We don't see the massive burning and pillaging and coming down of fortresses and cities and so forth. But that can be dealt with in a number of ways, and we can deal with that later. The theologically difficult issue for a lot of people is how can God order his people to go in and wipe out the Canaanites? And that's what it is. It's not really dispossessing them, but to actually destroy them and take over their land. So it is occupation by dispossession. That is the key word. The Hebrew word is yarad, which means to possess by dispossessing.
And in some instances, it feels like it's like men, women, children.
Yes, wipe out everybody.
And the question is, if God is a God of love, like how could he command something like this? It's a bit of an ethical dilemma for us.
It is. It is a very serious issue for a lot of people, and it is one of the things that in apologetics they have to deal with it very seriously, because it's one of the great arguments that people will give against the biblical God. You just have to read or listen to Richard Dawkins talk about this, and you'll get plenty.
So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so my own view is people commonly refer to this as holy war. First of all, that is a misnomer. The word holy war does not occur at all anywhere in the Bible. What the Bible refers to is the Lord's War, YHWH, commonly translated as Yahweh wars. In fact, in Numbers 21, verse 14, I believe, Moses refers to, or the author refers to, a book of the war of the Lord, or a book of the Lord's wars, in which he recorded things. And that gives us a very important initial principle to keep in mind, and that is, in this kind of warfare that God is asking Joshua now to, and the army to go and engage, the Lord is the leader of it. He is the prime warrior and general and captain that is leading and directing this. Why is that important? Because it is not Joshua or the people's initiative. It is the Lord himself that is directing it. And that is the key factor about all of these types of wars. So the question then is, if the Lord is directing it, why is he directing a war against a whole group of people, the Canaanites? What is his beef against them? Because if you really think about it, the Canaanites haven't really done anything to Israel. They are living there peacefully in their land. Well, peaceful is a relative word, as we shall see. They haven't come out and attacked Israel or whatnot. Israel is going to enter their territory and wipe them out. Why? They haven't provoked Israel. Well, the key is, in some way or another, they have provoked God. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is we have to avoid two misconceptions about this. And that is, this war, which we will call the Lord's War, is never for genocide or ethnic cleansing. God is not a racist. He does not wipe out people for just being a certain type of people, for their race or ethnicity. In fact, Deuteronomy makes very clear that about the universalism of God. God is the God of all nations, and he gives nations their territory. For example, he gave Edom the territory that is today kind of Saudi Arabia, and when the Israelites wanted to go through it, he said to them, do not touch the Edomites. They have their land. And even the Moabites, who are a little bit north of Edom, do not touch them. I have given them their land. So he gives people their land. So it's not for ethnic cleansing or genocide. That is to really blaspheme against God. The second reason is it is not merely for territorial expansion. It's not like God is saying, look, you guys need some land. There are people who have it. Kill them and take it. That would be tyrannical. It would be evil, and God is a moral God. So those two reasons are out. So what could possibly be the reason for God doing this? Well, in order to do that, we have to do a little bit of Bible searching, and the answer ultimately is, it is for judgment. It is judgment. In other words, the Canaanites up to now have been living under grace, but there has been a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. But now the time of grace is over, and they are ripe for judgment, and God is sending his army, Joshua and his army, to go in and execute his judgment upon a completely wicked and horrendously evil nation. How do we know this? Well, because the Bible tells us so. There are two passages I would like to point out to people to read carefully to understand what is going on. One is in Deuteronomy. We can go to Deuteronomy, and it is Deuteronomy 18. There are other passages in Deuteronomy, but this one nicely summarizes it. And let's see what it says.
This is a good example, as you're looking up that passage, this is a good example of why we need to read the whole Bible.
Exactly.
There's a section in Deuteronomy
that's applicable.
That's perhaps going to help us understand what's happening here in
Yeah.
Joshua.
Yeah. Before we read this, I should say this. Israel's foreign policy, the way she is to behave with the nations, is given in Deuteronomy 20. Once again, back to Deuteronomy 20. And there are two aspects to her foreign policy. One to do with the nations that are far off, the non-Canaanite nations, and one to do with the nations that are near, which are the Canaanite nations. And these are and they have to behave differently with these two groups. With the nations that are far away, they do not make war on them. they are to offer them terms of peace. And if they will live peacefully, then fine, you leave them alone. But to the nations that are near, you break down their altars, you wipe them out, you destroy them, and you tear all of their idols down, and you occupy their land. That is the foreign policy with the Canaanites. And in fact, if you know Joshua chapter 9, the Gibeonites, who are a Canaanite nation living right next door to Israel, they play a trick on Joshua. They somehow have gotten a hold of Deuteronomy 20, I don't know how, and they've learned Israel's foreign policy. And so what do? To avoid being annihilated, they dress up as in these old clothes and stale bread and worn out shoes, and they come to Joshua and say, we are from a faraway land, now make a peace treaty with us, a non-aggression peace treaty with us. And Joshua, of course, falls for that. He tests and he says, are you really from a far-off land? He tastes the bread, it is stale, and they make a treaty with them, and then they find out they're living right next door, but it's too late, they made the treaty and they cannot violate it. So those are the two aspects of Israel's foreign policy, but here is the spiritual reason. This is given in 18 verses 9 to 14. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire. In other words, that's what they were doing. The Canaanites had descended to child sacrifice. Who practices divination, which is witchcraft or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft or casts spells, or who is a medium or a spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. So there it is. It is for spiritual reasons. They have offended the holiness of God. You see, the land that is given to people by God is given in a system known as usufruct. That is, you live on the territory as long as you follow the rules of the owner. It's as if you rented out an apartment that you own, you expect the people to live according to the principles of contract. But if they go and open up a meth lab in it, you're going to kick them out because that was not part of it. So these people are living on God's land. All the land belongs to God. Genesis 1 verse 9, the Lord created the dry ground. Every square inch of the earth belongs to God. There is no such thing as First Nations inalienable rights to any land. The whole land belongs to God because he created it. And he can give it to certain people and he can take it away as they behave. The Canaanites have built meth labs, as it were, and bawdy houses on the land, and it's time to kick them out. Same thing, Leviticus chapter 18. You know, when you read Leviticus, you get that horrible list of sins about uncovering the nakedness of your kin and so forth. That horrible list, and not to commit incest, not to commit bestiality, not to commit homosexuality, and so on and so forth. And then you get this at the end of it. In Leviticus 18, what verse do I want? 24 to 30, and we'll end on this. Do not, in other words, you get this horrible list in all of chapter 18 of all these practices, and then 24 says, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. In other words, that whole list of sins is what they were actually committing. The Canaanites were committing. And they became defiled. Even the land was defiled. So I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. In fact, meaning the Canaanite sins had become so awful that even the land got a tummy ache and was disgusted and was ready to vomit these people out. And the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the foreigner residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all of these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. And here's the thing about God being a righteous God. Yes, now it's time for judgment for the Canaanites because of these sins, but God is a fair judge, meaning he's not partial. And so if his own people now start to do these things, he's not going to show any mercy on them just because he's people. Look what it says. And if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Everyone who does any of these detestable things, such persons must be cut off from their people. keep my requirements, and do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God. So, very clearly, this is not ethnic cleansing or anything like that. In fact, how do we know it's not ethnic cleansing? Because there are Canaanites in the people of God when they repented. And this, the Joshua story will tell us, one of the key Canaanites, Rahab, who was a prostitute, but turned to the Lord. It's not destroyed with the rest of her people. She's incorporated into the people of God, and she ends up marrying into the leading tribe, Judah, the leading family within that tribe, and becomes, as a result of that, a grandmother in the ancestry of our Lord. In fact, the ancestry of our Lord has several Canaanite women in it. There's Tamar, there's Rahab, there's Ruth, and there's Bathsheba. So God is not a racist. He's not against the Canaanites for being Canaanites. He's against the Canaanites for being wicked sinners in this way. And if his own people turn around now and misuse the land, that'll be the end of them.
So Joshua, one of the things Joshua is showing us is not only is God a God of love and grace and mercy, but he's also holy, just, and severe when
Extremely.
we rebel against him.
And it's a parallel to our own time, I believe. I believe we are in that time of grace. But there is a final judgment coming when it'll be over for us too.